Hi, this is Sarit Switzer, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast, a podcast devoted to the teachings of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi as recorded in his most famous work, the Tanya. My hope for this show is to make these teachings accessible and relatable to the average person, regardless of prior Jewish education or affiliation. The episodes follow the prescribed daily study portions and are meant to serve as practical lessons in how to live your life as your true self and develop an authentic and powerful relationship with your Creator. I have personally experienced the effects the study of this work has had on me, and I'm excited to share what I can of this knowledge with you. So please join me on this journey of learning, self-growth, and connection with your source. Hi, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast. This is episode 244 for the 25th of Tammuz in a leap year. So in yesterday's episode, we talked about the science of addiction. We talked about how it's possible for somebody to get to that state of becoming an addict and just how powerful that addiction is. We spoke about a very famous experiment involving rats, in which rats were given the opportunity to press on a lever that would stimulate the certain points in the brain that are often associated with addiction, that are very, very pleasurable in the moment and provide this instant gratification. And the lengths to which these rats would go to press this lever, even if it involved a lot of suffering, even if it involved starvation, they would still do whatever they could to press that lever to get that instant gratification. And we spoke about how this idea of addiction, well, we think of it in this way in terms of like being a heroin addict, being a food addict, being a cigarette addict, all of these really big vices. The truth is, according to my opinion anyways, I think that addiction can be a really useful tool for helping us understand pretty much all of the downfalls of life, all of the times in our lives when we choose instant gratification over living in line with our highest self, meaning ultimately living in line with the will of our Creator. This is, in a sense, the same mentality, the same mechanism by which an addict lives. Because if you really boil it down, there's this concept that a person would never sin unless a spirit of folly would enter into them. So there's this idea that when we sin, when we transgress the will of God, it's not me. While in the moment, it might feel like this is the most important thing for us to do. We must do this thing, and we feel compelled to do whatever it is that we're doing. The truth is, if we were really living in a sane way, if we were really living in line with our true self, we would never sin. Sin, by definition, is an act of insanity. It's an act of folly, because ultimately, on some deep, deep level, we know, our soul knows, that doing something against the will of God is not only harmful to God, it's harmful to us, and it's harmful to the world, and it's harmful to everything, really. There's no good that can come from it. Nevertheless, we do it, and we do it time and time and time again, right? That is the human condition. And that's because, just like we spoke about yesterday, the force that compels us towards this instant gratification is really so powerful. This is something that God created us with these compulsions, these instincts that are really so powerful that they can override our sane self. They can override our rational self that tells us, no, I don't want to be separate from my source. I don't want to be separate from who I am. But nevertheless, we do. And we fall again and again and again and again, which is okay, because that is what it means to be human. And that's what this whole entire section of the Tanya, Iggeres HaTeshuva, is really all about, is how do you heal from this separation? How do you restore? So the fact that this whole section is all about that, about Teshuva, it's kind of insinuating that it's implicit that you're going to sin, that you're going to transgress, that you're going to make mistakes, you're going to mess up, because this is what it means to be human again. So today we're going to start to work a little bit away from the disease itself of addiction, or of sinning, in other words, and we're going to start to learn what it means to heal, how to heal from transgression, how to do Teshuva, specifically how to do the lower form of Teshuva, which we'll get into this distinction as to what that means later on in terms of lower and higher Teshuva. But so what we'll learn today is that there are actually two stages of Teshuva, two stages through which we heal, through which we can be restored to our true self. And I think, once again, it could be helpful to look at the examples of addiction to really come to understand this. Because the way that I see it, well, a full-fledged addiction, yes, it might be extreme. It might be something that most of us, thank God, might not be clinically diagnosed with, hopefully. However, I do think that addictions can be thought of as like caricatures of understanding the broader human condition, meaning that we are constantly at war with our inclinations, with this impulse that we all have within us for instant gratification. And we're constantly fighting that urge. We're constantly trying to live in line with our highest self and not just live for that instantaneous moment of instant gratification. You could think about this like, let's say you come home from work and you're starving and you really want to eat a good supper. You know that supper is going to be really good for you, but then you look at the table and you see a box of cookies. It's all of us know that temptation. It feels like it would be so good to just go and eat those cookies. And sometimes maybe we do. Maybe we go for the cookies. We go for the instant gratification. When really the really nourishing option would be to cook yourself a nice home-cooked meal. Right? Or let's say you have a lot of work to do. You have a lot of things to take care of, and you open up your computer and Instagram pops up, Facebook pops up. And again, there's this instant gratification that we get through those likes, through those notifications that give us that instant dopamine rush. And it's really hard to fight against those temptations day after day after day after day. And this is what we do. And sometimes we fall. Maybe often we fall. This is also part of the human condition, is falling and getting back up again. So today we're going to talk about that process of getting back up again. How do we recover from the fall? How do we do teshuva, in other words, in the Hebrew language? And specifically, we're going to be learning about teshuva tata, which is the lower teshuva. We're going to talk about higher teshuva a little bit later on. And what we'll learn is there are actually two basic stages to this teshuva. The first stage is compassion, which means that you have compassion over your true self, your higher self, your godly self, in recognition of what it is that you have done to it, like how much you're not in line with your true self. Like, let's say you eat those cookies and you have this, and then you feel so gross afterwards, and then you say, oh my gosh, I feel so bad for my body that is craving real nourishment right now. So it's not so much about the guilt. It's not so much about feeling shame and guilt. It's more about feeling compassion. You feel a sense of compassion for your deepest and highest self. And then the second stage that we'll learn is actually subjugation. So subjugation, again, it's not shame, but it is about fighting and about oppressing that animal instinct, oppressing those forces, that force of instant gratification. So let's say day after day after day after day, you come home from work and you eat those boxes of cookies and you don't eat supper, and you eat the box of cookies, you don't eat supper. You come to a point where something happens and you have this like moment of revelation, I can't do this anymore, and you decide to eat supper. So the first level of that, again, is that feeling of compassion, is that you realize how poorly nourished your body really is of actual nutrients, and you decide that you want to get healthy, and so you feel this compassion. That's the motivating force towards you getting healthier. The second stage, though, is where you have to put in the work, where you have to actually go and get rid of the cookies, and maybe you need to make sure that you lock up any sweets that you have. You don't let yourself ever have cookies in your home or anything like that. So that's what we're going to learn about today, is these two stages of recovery, two stages of teshuva tata, in other words. And interestingly, maybe one of the reasons why I'm so this topic of addiction is on my mind is I happen to be reading a memoir about a recovering addict. It's called Love Warrior. It's a very good book. Anybody wants to read it. So anyway, so in the book, the woman is a recovering alcoholic and food addict. And it's a whole story about her life and her marriage. And, there's a lot of other themes and other addictions that come into play as well. But just focusing on her own addiction, I think it's really interesting that what you see in the story, and I apologize if this is a spoiler, if anybody reads it, but like people often say that when it comes to an addict, for an addict to come into a moment of recovery, they have to hit rock bottom. So this may be true in a certain sense, but I think that rock bottom doesn't necessarily have to mean that you hit like the bottom of the barrel, like you get to this point where you're living on the street and you like don't have any friends or family or anything like that. I think rock bottom can really simply mean that something happens in your life that like hits you like a rock, some sort of something like shocks you into sobriety. So in the case of this woman in the story, that actually is what happened. Where what happened was that, and as we'll see, this is very much related to this 2 stages of healing that we're going to learn about in the Tanya. So she was this party girl. She, for a lot of reasons, she had a very low self-esteem, and she would just like, she was a bulimic, and she was an alcoholic. She was also somewhat of a drug addict, and she just like was really throwing her life away, trying to escape reality and everything. And one day she had an unexpected pregnancy. I don't know how old she was, but I don't think she was a teenager, but I think she was pretty young. Like, she was very unprepared for this, really not ready to get married, not ready for any kind of seriousness, definitely not ready to have a child. But there's this scene, and it's a really powerful scene in the book, where she wakes up really hungover from another night of drinking and binging and everything like that. And she's feeling really, really, really nauseous. And at first she thinks it's just the alcohol, but then she starts to have this suspicion that maybe it's something else, because like just the nausea is so great and other things she's feeling in her body. And she decides to go to the store to get a pregnancy test. And then you find her on the bathroom floor vomiting and really sick and really ill. And then she looks over at that pregnancy test and she sees that it comes out positive. And she has this thought that enters into her mind where she decides, or she knows rather, that she's going to have the baby. And she feels, it's really amazing, she feels like this is a gift to her. She feels like somebody sent her a present in the form of a baby to really transform her life. So in other words, what she's feeling at that moment is this really deep sense of compassion for her unborn child, and ultimately compassion for herself, ultimately compassion for the child, the baby that's within her, and this feeling of great joy and hope over this new chance that she's been given. So the journey kind of just starts from there, so that it all really begins with this feeling of compassion, and it's motivated by compassion, her really transforming her life, overcoming her addictions, she getting married. She ends up getting married to the person, to her boyfriend who she became pregnant with. And so you really see that compassion, she has just this tremendous amount of compassion for herself. Her family displays compassion for her. It's really the primary drive behind her recovery. However, at the same time, maybe in terms of stage 2, we can think about it, she needs to put in work, and it's not easy. And you see how it's like she really struggles, and she is really tempted to go back to drinking alcohol, but she knows that she can't because of the baby. You know, you can't drink alcohol when you're pregnant, and especially if you're planning on raising a child. So she really works hard to be sober. So in other words, what she's doing in terms of Tanya terminology is she's subduing her Yetzer Hara. She's subjugating the evil inclinations, this inclination she has for instant gratification. She pushes it down, she breaks it to the point where she really is able to have control over it and is able to really become this very beautiful and healthy person. So again, so this is an example of an addict, and hopefully not all of us are addicts, or maybe some of us are, and that's okay too. But again, I think that looking at the extremes of addiction is a really helpful way, can be a really helpful way for us to really understand the struggles of life in general, the struggles of what it means to be human. And every time we go against our Creator's will, anytime we do something, we transgress something, even if it's something minor, we often have a moment afterwards of sobriety where we wake up and we feel this like hangover kind of, and we're like, what did I do? Why did I do that? That was so stupid. And so today we're going to really learn about, again, those 2 stages of how to come out from this, how to do tshuva, how to return to God on that very basic level of the tshuva tata, of restoring the lower hay to its source, as we say in Tanya terminology. So with that being said, let's get into the text and see how the Alter Rebbe explains all of this in a more kind of spiritual way instead of this more maybe human way that I've been describing it. So this is the beginning of chapter 7 of Iggeres HaTeshuva, the tractate of Teshuva. And the Alter Rebbe begins, and he says that there are 2 elements involved in a general sense of tshuva tata, of lower tshuva. What does lower tshuva mean? So we spoke about this before, especially at the end of yesterday's episode. We talked about this idea that lower tshuva is restoring the lower hay to its source. So again, we have the Yud K Vav K, that's the Tetragrammaton. It's the 4-letter name of God. And we talked about in previous episodes how each one of those letters corresponds to a different aspect of God in terms of the spheros, and how the last hey of that name is the source. It's like the funnel through which all of creation happens. So then when we think about our souls and when we think about how we were created in the image of God, the root of our souls really can be thought of in this lower hey, this lower hey tata. And when we sin, God forbid, when we transgress God's commandments, what we're doing is we're not only dragging our own souls down into the dirt and down into the sins, but we're actually drawing God down as well, because sinning really ultimately is an obstruction in the will of God. So the Alter Rebbe now, so going back to the text, so the Alter Rebbe says that to restore this lower hey, which is this lower tshuva, how do we do this? There's two ways to do this in a general sense. The first way is to arouse a sense of compassion, of supreme compassion from the source of compassion on their soul and on their godly soul, which fell down from its high place, from its high rooftop, which is life of life, blessed be he, into a deep pit, into an abira amikta, it's called in Aramaic, which is what is this deep pit? This is the chambers of impurity and the sitra achra, the other side. So again, so it's like when a person engages in some kind of transgression against God, what they're doing basically is they're taking their godly soul and they're bringing it down from its high place. The source of our godly soul is in God, which is the source of all vitality, and they drag it down, God forbid, into the tuma, into the impurity, into the other side, the side that obscures God. And so the Alter Rebbe is telling us that the first thing that we can do, the one thing that we can do in a general sense to do lo HaTeshuva, is to have compassion, to have mercy for this part of the soul. And we do this by arousing divine compassion, which is the name of Havaya. This tetragrammaton is the source of compassion. So we should arouse compassion from on high, from its source. As it says, and this is a quote from Yeshayahu chapter 55, verse 7, where it says, V'yeshov el Havaya v'irachamehu, where it says, he shall return to God and God will have compassion for him. Meaning to say that we should have compassion, we should arouse compassion on the fact that this name of Havaya, this name of the tetragrammaton, this holy name of God, got drawn down into the chambers of the sitra achra and into the forces of impurity. And not only did it get drawn down into there, it actually is vivifying them, because again, all vitality comes from God. So when this Yud Kei Vav Kei comes down into there, it's being forced to vivify them. So again, if we think about this idea of an addict, God forbid, it's like the person who doesn't really want to be doing their addiction, they don't really want to be engaging in that behavior, but yet that their will at that time, their body at that time, is involved in all of these negative behaviors that they're doing. So they are, it's like we can't say they don't have ownership, that they don't take responsibility for their actions. An addict is responsible for their actions because they're the one running the show. So same thing here. When we talk about the fact that we're drawing God, and this is through the deeds of us, like what we do when we transgress the will of God, through our negative thoughts and things like that, then what happens is we actually draw God down into the impurity, to the point that God, because ultimately it's not us that's running the show, it's God that's running the show. So we're forcing God, so to speak, to behave, to give vitality to these evil things. So it's like when we eat those cookies instead of making a nice supper for ourselves, yes, it's our choice to do that, but ultimately God is the one that is in control of our body. So not only are we making ourselves fall, but we're actually causing God to fall. We're causing God to give vitality to things, to actions that we should not be doing. And so it's like we're kind of like holding God captive in a way. So this explains a verse that we see from Shir HaShirim, chapter 7, verse 6, where it says, Melech asur bereitim. This, which means a king is bound with gutters. So what does that mean? It's the gutters of the mind, is how the Tikkunei Zohar explains this. Meaning this is the exile of the Shekhinah, as explained above. And so really, this is the first stage of tshuva, is that a person should really try to arouse compassion for not only for themselves, but for this godly source, for this Yud Kei Vav Kei that came down into the pits of Tuma, so which was caused by their actions. So it's interesting to me, again, that the emphasis isn't really, it's not about us feeling guilty. It's not about us being like, oh, I'm so bad. What did I do? But it's actually just like having a revelation about the effects of your action, having a moment of insight, of sobriety, of realizing that anytime we go against the will of God, what we're really doing is we're forcing God to come down into exile with us and come down into the impurity and move us. Because again, we don't have control over our action. Because this is the whole idea of like, do we have free will? Do we not have free will? Maybe it's a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's important to get into, is that while we have free will over our choices, so we can choose whether we want to do good or evil, ultimately, whatever we end up doing, that's God running the show. We don't have the power to move our bodies, to move our hands, to move our lips, even anything. Without God, even our thoughts, God is the one who is the driving force, the vitality behind all of these things. So all we can do is we're in the driver's seat in terms of choosing in which direction we want to go. So if we choose the wrong direction, if we choose the side of transgression, of going against the will of God, God's going to go with that, and God's going to vitalize our bodies in that way. And so when we realize this, then we realize that anytime we made a bad choice, anytime we did something that was against the will of God, nebach for God. Like, it's like we actually forced God to give vitality to these evil forces. And this is the whole idea of the exile of the Shekhinah. This is what it's all about. So now the Alter Rebbe goes on and he says the best time to really engage in this like meditation upon the compassion, having compassion for this part of God that we brought down into the Tumah, is during Tikkun Chatzot, is during this prayer that some people say at midnight. As it says in the Siddur, in a note there, and you can look there at length, the Alter Rebbe says. And then the Alter Rebbe says that this explains the idea in Eicha, which is from chapter 5, verse 16, where it says, Nafla ateret roshenu, oy na lanu ki chatanu, which means the crown of our head is fallen, woe to us for we have sinned. So basically, again, it's an allusion to the fact that it's like, that our soul source, which is the crown of our head, the keter, in other words, which means crown, which is the will, which is like kind of the connection force between us and God. So this fell through our sin. So anytime we sin, we're bringing the source of ourselves down with us. And this is why in Pirkei Hechalos, which is a sefer written by the Kabbalist Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, then God is called Melech Aluv, a humiliated king, because there's nothing more humiliating than this. Like, imagine how humiliating it would be if you'd be forced to do something that is against your will, and not only against your will, like something you don't want to do, but something totally contrary to your will. Like, imagine if, let's say, if you think about a politician that you really, really hate, and I won't name anybody specific, I'll let you guys think of that on your own. It could be on any side of any aisle. Imagine if there was a politician that you hated with all of your guts. Imagine somebody so evil, an evil dictator even, or something like that. And imagine that you were forced to be nice to them. You were forced to take them out to dinner. You were forced to give them presents. Like, it's like, it makes you nauseous even to think about this. And it's extremely humiliating to do that, to kiss their feet, And that's basically what's happening anytime a person engages in a transgression, is they're dragging God together with them to do this. And especially when a person really takes the time to meditate upon the greatness of God, who fills all the worlds and surrounds all the worlds. Again, memale kol amin, sovev kol amin. We spoke about these terms earlier in previous episodes. Each person, according to the ability of their minds, they're going to be very grieved by this. So this is not going to be a meditation that makes them happy. It's going to be a meditation that is going to, again, it's not about guilt or shame necessarily, but it's about just feeling really like, oh, wow, this is what I did. I can't believe it. Just like, again, if you think of that imagery, going back to the book that I'm reading, that woman on the floor, when she finds out that she's pregnant and she has a baby inside of her, and she has this like wake up call of like, oh my gosh, I've been dragging my baby into this filth. What have I done? Like, it's this like, what have I done moment of realization. Okay, so that's stage one. That's the first part of Teshuva. Or to be clear, the Alter Rebbe doesn't actually call them stages. He says they're just two elements of Teshuva. So it's possible that they actually happen simultaneously. I interpreted them as stages, but it could be it's the Alter Rebbe says, to be clear, he says they're two different elements. So the first element, as we said, is compassion. It's arousing this feeling of compassion for our godly source within ourselves, for the fact that we've dragged it down into such a low place. The second element now is to actually subdue and crush the klipa, the husks, and the sitra achra, the other side, because its entire being is arrogance and disgustingness. Like it's really gross. So it's like, once we realize, like when we realize, like, oh wow, this is really this behavior is really, really bad, then it's not enough to just feel compassion for our soul. We have to do something about it. So we have to actually subdue it, and we have to crush it. We have to crush that force of instant gratification, crush the addictive substance, get it away from us, basically. And the Alter Rebbe is telling us that this force of the sitra achra, this force of the other side, this instant gratification, as I'm calling it, is the epitome of grossness and arrogance. It's a very arrogant type of thing. So again, if you go back to that experiment with the rats, it's like that lever, kind of like if that lever had a consciousness, it would know that it's like way more powerful than any of the other forces, the force of hunger, the force of the shocks that the rat has to get to it. It's confident, and it's way more than confident, it's arrogant. So we need to crush that arrogance. We need to crush that force that is exuding itself as being so powerful. And the Alter Rebbe now brings a verse here from Ovadja, chapter 1, verse 4, which states this idea of this arrogance, where it says, "Im tagbia kanesher," if you exalt yourself like an eagle. So it's basically, the Alter Rebbe is saying that anytime a person engages in any kind of transgression, it's not only is it just something negative, it's actually like the epitome of arrogance. So in order to crush this arrogance, in order to really get rid of it and like crush it to death, to nullify it, it needs to be subjugated. It needs to be really subdued. And so the way that we do this, how do we subdue it? How do we crush it? It's through a broken and contrite heart, a sense of personal unworthiness, where we really feel this sense of lowliness. So this is where, yes, a little bit of shame does come in. Even though our culture is so against shame, here it is okay to feel a little bit of shame. It's like we need to feel just really low. We need to really humble ourselves. As it says in the Zohar, on the pasuk, and this pasuk is from Tehillim 51, chapter 51, verse 19, where it says, "Zivchei Elokim ruach nishbera lev nishbar v'nitkeh v'chulei," where it says offerings to Hashem are a broken heart and a contrite heart. And what's interesting about this verse, and the Alter Rebbe is going to break this down, is that if you look at the Hebrew, it says Zivchei Elokim, which means like offerings to God, yes, but the name of God is very specific here. It's the name of Elokim. It's not the Tetragrammaton, it's the name of Elokim. And so why? Because we know that there's a difference between, as we've spoken about previously, between the two basic, like, fundamental names of God, the name of Havaya, the Tetragrammaton, and the name Elokim. One big difference between them is that the name Havaya is an allusion to mercy. It's when we want to talk about God in terms of his attribute of mercy, as being merciful, we talk about the name of Havaya, the Tetragrammaton, the Yud Kei Vav Kei. But when we want to talk about God's attribute of justice, that's more associated with the name Elokim. And so the Alter Rebbe goes on to explain that. So he says that this is why, specifically, if you look at it, when it says Zivchei Elokim, the offerings to Elokim is a broken and contrite heart. Because, why? Because we see that anytime it talks about bringing an offering of an animal, it always talks about bringing an offering to Havaya, to the Tetragrammaton, which is the aspect of rachamim, of compassion, of mercy. But when it comes to Elokim, it's not about bringing an animal, but actually what we do is we bring a broken spirit, because it's all about breaking that spirit of the impurity in the Sitra Achra, which is the idea of having a broken spirit. And how do we break the spirit of the Sitra Achra? This happens through a broken heart. So through a lowly and broken heart. So that's the end of the section. So just to kind of like bring it all together. So again, we started talking about this idea of how it is that we can return, how we can do this lower tshuva. And we said that there were basically two aspects to it. So you can think of them as stages, or maybe they go hand in hand at the same time. It's not really clear, but basically the one aspect of tshuva is compassion. One aspect is really have compassion on the godly soul, on the godly part of yourself, and on really God himself, who you drag down God forbid, into the impurity through your transgressions. Because every time we do something that's against the will of God, we're dragging God into it as well. Because ultimately, God vitalizes everything in the world, which means that when we're engaging in that transgression, God is vitalizing that transgression, because it can't be vitalized from anything else. So that means we're forcing God to do things that are not only against his will, but that are like really against his will, that he really, really doesn't want to do. And that's so humiliating. So we should feel this sense of compassion for God, like for what we've done for him and for our godly souls. And just like, again, we can think about that woman when she found out that she was pregnant in the memoir I'm reading, where she just had this tremendous feeling of compassion for her baby, tremendous feeling of compassion for herself, really, ultimately, in this realization of where she fell to, of herself sitting on this bathroom floor, surrounded by vomit and, and all of that. So that's one thing, one level. The other level is this feeling of subjugation, of this this realization that in order to really heal, in order to really return, you need to subdue the Yetzer Hara. You need to subdue the animal soul. You need to subdue the spirit of the Sitra Achra, these forces. You need to crush them and break them. And what that involves really is it starts on the inside. It involves a broken heart. It involves really humbling yourself, really coming to this place of shame. It's really about feeling lowly, not getting outside of the haughtiness that you were living your life before. When you're living your life in a way that is not with an awareness of God, you think you're so powerful. You think that you can do anything. You think you're running the show. But once you've realized that, no, it's actually God running the show, this can bring a profound sense of humility. It should bring a profound sense of humility and even shame, and bring a person to a place of brokenness. And perhaps this is what people mean by reaching rock bottom. It's not so much about external forces bringing them to a sense of rock bottom, but rather it's an internal process of really breaking yourself down to come to this lowly place. So that's it for today. And we're going to continue with this chapter tomorrow. So stay tuned and I will speak to you then. Thanks for listening to the It Is Taught podcast, hosted by Sarit Switzer. This podcast is dedicated in loving memory of my maternal grandfather, Avraham Yitzchak ben Binyamin HaKohen of blessed memory. Music by Shoshana. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the show, please share it with others and subscribe on YouTube, Apple iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to leave us a 5-star review. To find out more about the It Is Taught project, including more information on my soon-to-be published book, please visit our website, itistaught.com. To catch the latest from me, follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Looking forward to speaking with you tomorrow, and until then, have a great day.